Welcome to the Doctor is In podcast. I'm your guest host this week, Tad Hussey. I'm a fellow podcaster. I host the Cannabis Cultivation and Science podcast, and Nadia has graciously invited me to come on this week and interview her about the origins of her podcast and some of the things she has learned over the past 5 years. Now on to the show. Hi, Nadia. Welcome to the Doctor is In podcast.
Hey, Tad, thank you so much for being my guest host today. I'm super excited to talk to you about my podcast.
Yeah, well, let's just dive right in. So, why did you create the Doctor is In podcast in the first place?
The reason I created the podcast was to help to facilitate and create a growers network. I really wanted to create a portal for growers to learn from other growers. Some people may know that education is probably my first love. It's why I got a PhD in the first place, so that I'd have the option to be a professor one day at a university, and have turned that into my consulting style, right? Like education is always part of our consulting and our engineering. And so I saw the podcast as an opportunity to develop that further, to reach out to growers and vendors and other stakeholders in the industry, to really elevate the conversation, to create terminology that everybody understood, so that even if somebody were to call on us to hire us, there are some terms and some concepts that they would already be familiar with or understand, and we wouldn't necessarily be starting from the beginning. And one of the things that evolved over time in the creation of this podcast is, if you listen to some of the very early episodes when I'm interviewing growers, is that I ask them all the same question. Is this industry, whether it's cannabis or CEA in general, is this industry more collaborative or competitive? Because it really felt like people wouldn't talk, right? And that has been one of the challenges, honestly, in the success of our industry, especially when looking at vertical farming and weirdly lettuce growing, is that people felt like they had this secret sauce, that they had this IP, these trade secrets, and weren't sharing knowledge, right, across the industry. And we have kind of seen the results of that today, which is that we've seen a lot of failures, unfortunately, high profile failures. And so but these growers are willing to talk to me. And so I wanted to ask them directly what they thought of this industry, right, being competitive or collaborative. And almost every single guest answered the exact same way, which is, well, our company is competitive with other companies, but growers, we're all talking to each other, right? We're collaborating, we're sharing the failures and successes. And that's why I'm on the podcast, right, talking to you, Nadia, is because I want to share my knowledge and experience and expertise with other growers, so that they don't make the same mistakes, or so that, you know, they succeed as well. And, ultimately, when we collaborate, that increases the chance of our success, both, internally as a company, but also as an industry overall. And so, because I kept getting that same answer about competitiveness and collaborativeness, I think that's a word. I kind of moved away from that question because it was very clear what the answer was. And I was so excited that that was the answer, because so many growers have told me, um, you know, which is one of my favorite compliments, that everything they learned about growing was from my podcast. Now, I don't know that that's necessarily
Wow.
true. And I think there's a lot of other resources out there, probably your podcast, Tad, your KIS podcast, they've learned a lot from. But I do love that compliment. And that's exactly what I was trying to achieve, was that collaboration and that knowledge exchange. And so I feel like we're succeeding at that.
Well, I can say confidently that I learn something new every time I get to have a conversation with you. And one question that brings up for me is, and a comment as well, is as a consultant myself, I find that a lot of what I consult on is helping people avoid the mistakes that I've already made as a grower in the
Yeah.
past. Learning through failure, learning through mistakes. And one of the questions I have for you then is, as a consultant, uh, do you feel, because you and I've talked about this, do you feel like you're giving away information, like too much information? Because people talk about being competitive and holding back those secrets. As an engineer, how do you feel about just sharing freely about, some of the things that people need to know about?
Yeah. No, that's a really good question. And what I have learned over the years is that, if you give a little, right, you get back a lot. And there are always, I create these episodes, and sometimes I think, well, is this something that I want to give away or share with the world when somebody could be hiring me for an hour consulting or whatever and asking some of these questions that I'm sharing freely? And ultimately, it's hard to go into a super deep dive anyway in a podcast. Like, yes, I might have a lesson specifically on why is HVAC so hard, or about air purifier technology, but that's really just kind of scratching the surface. And every project is so unique, right? I can't, in a podcast, in a 30-minute podcast, or even an hour and a half interview, go into such a deep dive that everyone is going to know exactly how to apply that to their specific operation and facility and crop. But what I'm doing instead is saying, look, if for example, I did an air purifier episode recently, and it was like, look, here are the 4 or 5 types of air purifiers that might come across your email or a salesman or a trade show, and just understand what is good and what is bad and you want to run away from, so that then when they come to us and say, hey, I want to create a really clean, growing environment, they're asking me about the 2 good ones, not about the 5 or 6 other one, right? All of the above,
Yeah.
because they already know that I'm going to lead them away from those. And so it really just helps to focus the conversation, helps to focus the consulting, and people already come to us with an understanding of what it is they want, in their facility, as well as from us. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's something that we hear also from a lot of the interviews, is that, look, I might be dealing with spider mites in my facility, and you are too, and these are the solutions that I have found work in my facility. That doesn't mean that those same exact solutions, right, are going to help another grower, but at least they know where to start, right? And I think that is the biggest thing, is like, these other things don't work. These things could work. You might even find something that's different. And we'd love to hear from you, right? If you find something different. So I am not so worried about that anymore.
That's great. Yeah. And I think these conversations that you have can potentially spark innovation too. I know I've seen some stuff from the cannabis side of things where people are trying out new things, around under canopy airflow, for example,
Right.
based on listening to a podcast of you and talking about airflow and just thinking about these topics, getting people thinking more about air purification, airflow, and just keeping it top of mind, I think is really great.
Yeah,
So
and on that airflow topic, under canopy airflow, I think we've talked about a couple times, and people ask, and we definitely see it in facilities that we visit. And I'm not always a fan of under canopy airflow. It's not the solution for every operation. And but I want you to understand why. Right. And it might not be that it's bad. It's just that you need to also, the grower should be thinking about XYZ other variables that are going to be impacted by under canopy airflow. Right. So that's the educational piece, is like, look, like, here's what that looks like. Here's what you need to be aware of. And if you don't know how to measure those things or how to document the impact of those things, that's where we can come in and help you do that, right? So that you can optimize your growing facility with, the systems that you have or want to employ.
So this is going to be episode 101. So after 100 episodes, do you feel like you've accomplished this goal of what you originally intended when you started out, or has the goal evolved or changed over time?
I mean, based off of the feedback that we get from growers who tune in and who, learn everything they know about growing from the podcast, uh, I I think we have accomplished that goal, but that doesn't mean that I want to stop working on that goal, right? Like, okay, we've made the touchdown, but there's more touchdowns to make, right? And so I want to continue, working towards that same goal of having that collaborative spirit with growers, but also with other industry stakeholders, right? Whether those are vendors or regulators or, just other people who are servicing the industry, like academic researchers. And growers and researchers don't always have a direct line of communication, right? And vendors are trying to learn what growers need, and that is evolving as we're changing, going from indoor to greenhouse or switching from HPS to LED. And so, part of the goal of this podcast is to, increase that conduit of communication to, I call myself sometimes a translator because I speak plant and grower and I speak engineer. And now we talk to regulators and standard developers as well, and make sure that, uh, the the mandates that they set in place aren't going to, negatively impact profits or productivity. But hearing what the grower needs and what's actually possible, I then communicate that to the regulators, and from the regulators back to the growers and the greenhouse vendors and the people who are going to be impacted by those codes. So, my goal is always going to be the same, which is going to be increasing, the lines of communication and networking between all of these entities that don't always work together or might even seem to be working in conflict with each other, right? And there should be no conflict, right? Like, we should all be in all of this to we should be in this together. And I'm always, looking for the common ground. What can we all agree on? And by finding that, right, we raise the ship, right? And that's one of the biggest goals of my podcast and really of what I do in the CEA industry. In terms of evolution, uh, like I mentioned, with growers, it was like, is this competitive or collaborative? And one of the things that has evolved, maybe even away from that, is doing more specific topics, even in talking to researchers. Some of the research episodes have been really popular, taking a deep dive into what causes leaf tip burn, or taking a deep dive into, lighting efficiency. uh, one of the one of my favorite episodes is actually one of our listeners' favorite episodes, for 2 years running now, which is with Bruce Bugby. And another one of my favorite compliments that I've heard several people have said, I've listened to so many interviews with Bruce Bugby or seen him speak at so many conferences, and I learned a lot of new things by listening to your interview with him. And I love that, right? Like, it's not just canned questions, I guess, right? Like, it's engaging, and I think that's why a lot of people like the podcast. And so one of my biggest takeaways from that episode, and there's a lot of good nuggets in there, is about spectrum of light. And when we get down to it, I ask him the question, if a plant has enough light, does spectrum matter? And this is one of his responses of, that's a great question. Because when you get down to it, most of the research that's publishing how plants respond to red light and pink light and green light and UV light and whatever light spectrum is performed at very low quantities of light. And so a plant, right, is craving light. And so they're going to take what they can get. But if you give a plant plenty of light, enough, right, like enough photons, right, and you feed it enough photons, that quality doesn't matter as much anymore, if at all. And he compares that to eating, right? To our diet. If you only eat 1,000 calories every day, what you eat really matters. You need to make sure that you get right your protein and your carbs and your fat and your oils and your enzymes and everything. And so it has to be very balanced. But if you eat a 5,000 calorie diet, chances are you're getting all those things, right? Even if it's like in a small quantity. And so I just, every time I listen to that little segment, I'm just like, man, I will never look at lighting research again or the same again, right? It's mind blowing, and I think that I'm guessing that's probably one of the nuggets that some of our listeners have taken away from that particular podcast is all this talk about spectrum. Does it matter in the end? If you can, switch spectrum and do all these, do this dance with wavelengths. At the end of the day, if you're feeding a plant, 1500 ppfd, does the plant care? So, yeah.
Yeah. As you were saying this, it made me think about what goes into interviewing someone for a podcast and the
Mm.
questions and sort of that. Can you touch on how that might have changed or how you feel being on the other side of the microphone, I guess to say? Because I know you've done a lot of interviews, and usually I first saw you were speaking at a convention, so you definitely have a lot of experience with that. What's it like turning the tables?
Oh, I love that question. It takes time, honestly. Every guest is so different. Some guests I've known for a long time, and I see at every conference, and I know their resume or their CV pretty well, and so it's pretty easy to kind of formulate the questions. Sometimes actually that makes it harder. Right, to kind of distill the questions into a few and not have like a 4-hour conversation, which I've almost had with some of my guests. Well, not really 4 hours, but 2 hours, which turns into 2 episodes. And others I don't know very well at all, but I'm very interested in their research or in their involvement in the industry. And so I have to do some additional background uh, you know, uh, research on their profile and what got them into CEA. And I love hearing about origin stories of my guests and how they got into CEA. I mean, they are all so different. Some started in floriculture and moved into cannabis. Some started in lettuce and moved into cannabis. Some started in cannabis and moved into lettuce, right? Like, I mean, some, had no experience or background in horticulture at all, and they discovered it and just love working with plants. And I love those stories. But yeah, I spend a couple of hours at least on every single interview, um, you know, s- figuring out, who they are and how we're going to sort of profile them, and then coming up with questions. And a lot of times I know exactly, I know what questions I want to ask them because it's why I asked them to be a guest in the first place, right? But for those of you who listen all the way through the end of an episode, you know that I have these sort of off script questions that I prepared in advance, but the guest doesn't know what those questions are because I always give them the questions ahead of time so that they can prepare. Sometimes they look at them, sometimes they don't, sometimes they send it through marketing and they edit them. It really depends on the guest. But I always have these unscripted questions at the end. And honestly, those can take me more time to come up with because I really want to make them laugh at the end. To me, that's the success. That's like the sign of a successful podcast if I get them to chuckle at the end of the podcast. So I don't know. I'm always trying to think of something clever to ask them at the end. But yeah, I mean, it can be really hard. Sometimes I will have 20 questions and I'm like, I have got to narrow this down to like five or, at most 10. And sometimes we don't even get to all of the questions because I really use that as a sort of a roadmap or a guide. For the conversation, and so they also know what's in my head and what we're going to be talking about. But we go off on tangents. If they want to expand on something, then we go there, and so that doesn't leave time necessarily for all the questions. But my hope is that it's a successful podcast and they'll come back on and I'll get to ask those other questions the next time.
Yeah, I find being an active listener and also formulating a lot of times the conversation will pop up new questions and then I want to remember those questions, but you can't just be sitting here typing or taking notes
You're
necessarily
right.
very effectively in the middle of an engaging conversation. So it sounds like similar to you. You would agree that like interviewing someone is actually harder than being interviewed in a lot of ways,
Oh yeah.
um, which is ironic and kind of unexpected, I think.
It's so true. And
Um,
when I'm being interviewed, a lot of times I don't actually want to know the question ahead of time. I want it to be a spontaneous answer and what I'm thinking in that moment. And I think, some of my guests are the same. Like I'll send them the questions ahead of time and they didn't look at them or they might have just scanned them. Others actually prepare answers to those questions, which, both work, right? Whatever your personality type is or your comfortableness is being interviewed. I'm fine either way, and I'm just grateful to have you as a guest and as an expert.
well, you mentioned origin stories. Do you want to share a little bit about your origin story or maybe the
Hmm.
podcast origin story for folks?
Yeah, sure. Well, where my origin story. So I discovered controlled environment agriculture working on a shiitake and oyster mushroom farm in a greenhouse, growing them in a greenhouse in southern Idaho when I was an undergraduate at UC Davis 27 years ago now, in 1998. I feel very blessed that I discovered CEA growing mushrooms because anyone who's grown mushrooms knows that, you give it all of the nutrients and all of the water it needs in the substrate it's growing in. And most mushrooms don't need light, or light is just kind of an extra benefit for some species. And so the thing that we're really trying to control when growing mushrooms is the environment, the temperature and the humidity and the CO2 and oxygen level. And so working on this mushroom farm, that's what I was focused on, was trying to create the right environment. And in southern Idaho, it's just like Nevada, the climate. So it's hot and dry, and we're growing mushrooms that want 65 degrees and like 80%, 70% relative humidity in this really dry climate in a greenhouse that lets light in that we don't need. And it was really challenging. Humidity control was really challenging, but the opposite of what most growers, green plant growers would be used to. And I had my aha moment. Like I fell in love with farming. I lived in a little 20-foot trailer right on the farm, and woke up at 4 in the morning every day with the workers who would come in and spawn the substrate and sterilize the substrate and do all this work. And at first, I was really annoyed to be woken up at 4 in the morning. And by week two, I was like, you know what? I'm awake anyway. I might as well just join them, right? If you can't beat them, join them. And so that's how I developed, sort of my work ethic of getting up early in the morning, was working on that mushroom farm. And I loved it. I loved farm life. I, lived and worked on this farm for 3 months, and I was like, this is how I want to help farmers. I want to help them control their environment. And so from then on, I pursued mushroom production. I went to Penn State for my master's degree and studied air distribution in commercial mushroom houses, which, if anyone has been in a commercial mushroom house or seen it, I call it the original vertical farm because you grow mushrooms in stacks in multiple layers. And guess what? They had challenges with uniformity and temperature and humidity control, in 3 dimensions, just like vertical farmers and now cannabis growers working in 2 or 3 tiers are dealing with. And I was working on this, 20, 25 years ago now. It's hard to believe. And after I did that, I went to the University of Arizona and said, well, maybe I'll try a different crop. I'll grow tomatoes or a vegetable crop instead and in a greenhouse. And so for my PhD, I studied, ventilation, evaporative cooling, air movement, VPD control, for my PhD, for greenhouse tomato production, and even had the opportunity to do a research stint in Japan working in the world's largest agricultural based wind tunnel, where we had a 1/15th scale model of my greenhouse in Tucson, Arizona, sitting on basically a lazy Susan that we would rotate, to change the direction of wind, and airflow, to see how wind direction and wind speed affected natural ventilation in a greenhouse. It was really cool. And while I was getting my PhD, I realized that so many graduate students, went to land grant universities, love the land grant, university program, but it was all the same technology, right? It was the same type of greenhouses. It was pad and fan cooling, it was ventilation, natural ventilation. And I wasn't seeing a lot of innovation. And when I was at Penn State, I took architectural engineering courses where I learned about HVAC design. And so I said, I want to go out and get a real job, which is hard to do when you have a PhD, let me tell you. Like to start as a mechanical engineering consultant, or designer, after having a PhD, it's like, why should we hire you, right? Like you have this other thing that you're an expert at. But I got a job and learned how to be a mechanical engineer, learned about HVAC design for laboratories and hospitals and animal facilities and educational facilities and office buildings. And here, fast forward, that was 2007, fast forward, 8 or 9 years, and we were getting these projects, as cannabis licenses, were being distributed, and vertical farming, was, catching fire. That idea was, and we were starting to get projects at the company I worked for, and I realized, this is the time and the place. If I really want to merge my two passions of agriculture and HVAC and CEA, into one thing, I have to do this on my own. And so that's when I started Dr. Greenhouse, was in 2016. It's been more than 8 years now, that we've been in business, and we've worked on 200 projects in 38 states and 6 Canadian provinces and 13 other countries. Delivering innovative HVAC and climate control solutions to growers, of every crop, of every facility type, and every type of region and climate, from the Arctic to the tropics. And I love doing that. Um, and hope to do it as long as possible. Hopefully, this current state of affairs that we're in, with tariffs and, just uncertainty in the market. Hopefully, we come out of that with, I don't know, just a new hope and a new optimism for this industry. And what I will just add on to the end of that is that a lot of what we've been doing lately is working on existing facilities. So, I've been sort of traipsing around, the country, visiting, existing operations and talking to growers about how they can improve and optimize their climate control with the equipment and the systems and the facility that they have right now. Because maybe ownership or investors are willing to spend $500,000 on making improvements to an existing facility rather than, investing $20 million on a brand new facility that who knows, if that's going to pay back or what the market's going to look like a year or 5 years from now. So that's really fun for me, is getting to work one-on-one with growers, and helping them solve problems right on the spot, and then develop budgets to make more capital improvements in the future. That was a really long-winded answer.
Well, I have another question for you. So you're going to be talking some more here. In terms of the podcast itself, what inspired? I mean, you mentioned this idea of facilitation and expanding networks and bringing people together, but what was sort of the context around inspiring a podcast of all, media forms?
Yeah. You know what? So I started my podcast almost exactly 5 years ago during COVID. So the world shut down right around March 18th. And I remember that date very well because I remember on March 17th, which was St. Patrick's Day, I went to one of my favorite restaurants, sat at the bar and had an old fashioned, and there were two people in the entire restaurant, and we were sitting there just talking about contemplating where the world was going. And the next day it was shut down. And so a few weeks later, I just had this idea like, I want to check in with my friends and colleagues in the industry to see how they're doing and what their predictions are for the industry, and for their companies, as the pandemic was taking hold. And so, we posted our first podcast in April of 2000, and it was me literally just checking in, with these colleagues and friends. Some of them will be familiar, to you, Tad, and to our listeners. I had Suzanne Buglady, I had Allison Justice, Chris Higgins, Tom Buja, who's a grower up in Washington, and just asking them, like, what do you think is going to happen? Are you feeling an impact already on your sales, whether you're selling a product or selling a plant, and what's going on with you? And so we had these 30-minute to 60-minute conversations, and they were just kind of friend to friend almost, and we posted those and we got really good response. And so I was like, maybe we can turn this into something bigger. And some of you might know that I host these workshops, these educational workshops, in Sacramento. We've taken them on the road a couple of times, where we take these deep dives into climate control and HVAC design. And I love these workshops, and we always get a really great turnout. And with the pandemic, I was like, well, now how am I going to, to reach people if it's not going to be in person at conferences or a workshop, or networking opportunities? I still want to reach the growers and to provide some educational content. And so how can we do that? And so that's when, we decided, well, let's turn this podcast into, an educational podcast. The doctor is in, and just hear from growers. And, where I'm not the only one who's standing up in front of a group of people telling them what they could or should do, but hear from growers about what they are doing, boots on the ground, to facilitate that grower knowledge exchange. And it worked out. And at the same time, we launched our newsletter. I started writing a blog every month, which I can't believe how consistent I've been with writing a blog for 5 years. I guess that must mean there must be 60 blogs now. We're just trying to get content out there, like everybody else, right? How do we educate remotely? And so COVID was really, the impetus for that. So in some ways, I'm grateful for COVID because it helped me to create these great assets for the industry.
And I think too, the nice thing about podcast is it's fluid and it's constantly evolving. Whereas
Yeah.
other forms of media, like a book, you can never really add on to it as you grow and learn. And I also think the fact that you can have more collaboration with a podcast is really, really nice in terms of what content you're able to put out there. So yeah, I think you touched on it
Yeah,
really well.
absolutely. And in terms of content, you know, a lot of times I'm inspired by discussions that are on LinkedIn, right? And what people are talking about there, or what conversations I had at a conference. or with a potential client, and they're asking really good questions. I'm like, you know what? That is podcast material. I should just, rather than repeating myself with every new potential lead, maybe if I just had a podcast about it, I could save a little bit of my breath during that lead call. Not always, not everybody listens to it, but at least it's something even that I can point to and say, hey, if you want to learn more about, greenhouse saving opportunities, check out episode. I should know the episode number if I'm going to reference it. I don't know it, but check out this episode where I talk about, specific energy saving opportunities for a greenhouse. And so it just becomes also something that I can lean on and maybe even talk at a high level at, in a lecture or conference, but then say, hey, I take this deeper dive in the podcast episode. Go check that out. And if you still have more questions, please, by all means, come to me.
So at some point in time, I feel like you're going to run out of friends and colleagues. So I guess the question is,
Oh, no, don't say that.
how do you vet and determine who you have on your podcast? Because this is the challenge that
Ooh,
I face. So I'm kind of curious to hear your answer.
that is a really good question because definitely we get people who ask to be on the podcast. And, sometimes I know who they are and I'm like, oh, yeah, that'd be great. Or I met you at a conference and, I liked the topic of conversation that we had. And so, okay, like, let's have another conversation to make sure, that we're on the same page in terms of delivery or content. Um, but there are some people who have been suggested to me or who reach out and say they want to be on the podcast, and they'll even have a topic that they want to discuss. But sometimes it is so salesy, right? This is that's what I'm always trying to avoid, is that as a sales pitch. I don't, like, we have companies who, or people from companies that are represented on the podcast. We've had Dan Detmers from Quest, we've had Craig Berg from Desert Air, and we'd have more HVAC companies represented, but they weren't selling Quest or Desert Air equipment. We were talking about the process of dehumidification. We were talking about the process of a package DX unit, and different type of HVAC systems that you could employ in an indoor grow facility and what's challenging about that. And that's what I'm looking for, is just a bigger picture discussion, not a sales pitch for your specific equipment. And I also want to talk to experts for, with those particular vendors, if we're going to have a vendor represented on the podcast. Not the sales guy who's knocking on the door, or that you necessarily see, at an exhibitor's booth that's selling you something. I want to talk to the technical department, right? To the factory, to the people who understand the nuts and bolts of how that equipment works, so that we can, again, it's about education. And when it comes to HVAC in particular, it is so complicated. That equipment is so complicated. No grower, unless they have an engineering degree, should be an engineer, should have to, be a mechanical engineer or facilities engineer in their facility. And so, having these discussions with, HVAC vendors, specifically, is really about helping growers understand what makes these equipment tick and why they might be challenging to operate or control or get, exactly the conditions that you're trying to get as a grower. And so, that's part of my vetting process is, who is going to educate, right? Not just who is going to sell something. Same with lighting vendors, right? And recently I've been talking a lot more to researchers, and I love it because we are getting so much more research out of universities for all crops. at all technology and sort of, environmental factors that influence the plant. And, as these university programs grow and there are more and more of them throughout the country, I'm hope, we're going to have more graduate students, more researchers who are studying more factors and variables and opportunities for growers to implement. And so I want to be talking to them because that is the state of the art, right? That's the state of the research. And I want, to get that information out to growers as quickly as possible because for example, talking about like that Bruce Bugbee interview and talking about quality versus quantity of light, if you have that is so educational because if you're looking at 5 different lighting vendors and they all provide the same level of PPFD and they're all the same efficacy and efficiency, et cetera, what is the next differentiating factor that you can look at? Is quality important, right? If someone's trying to sell you on that over here, but someone else says, well, white lighting is all you need. If you listen to that podcast, you can hopefully make that decision for yourself or at least know what questions to ask those vendors, right? I think that is one of the biggest things is like, you might not know everything, but if you know what questions to ask, then you can, think about that information, analyze it for yourself, and then maybe come to me or Bruce or someone else that you trust to help you, I don't know, just evaluate the value of both of those responses. So that is ultimately what I'm looking for is someone who's going to educate and that I'm going to learn from too. I mean, I learned like you, Tad, I learn something every single time I interview someone. A lot of times the questions that I come up with when I are truly out of curiosity. I don't know the answer, right? It's not like they're canned questions like I know what you're going to say. They're not like these softball questions. They're really because I want to know. I want to know what you think. What do you define as efficiency? And every time I ask that question, Tad, I get a different answer. That's amazing to me, right? When we're talking about metrics and that we need these standard metrics in the industry, if we don't even have a standard definition of efficiency, like what does that mean for the industry? And so that's the other thing, right? And like creating this grower or industry network is if you hear 6 different people give 6 different answers to efficiency, what does that mean for the future of the industry, right? What is important to all of these different stakeholders and how do we, you know, continue the conversation? I would say that's probably one of the downsides of having a podcast is that it is kind of, it's one directional. And I would love to have a way to bring those conversations together more. And we've talked about doing webinars and having panels and stuff, but that's a whole other level of preparation. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Like you, I put a lot of effort into vetting my guests, and that's always a challenge. This idea of bridging the gap between research and growers, I think, is a really important a concept that you touched on because on the flip side, what I was thinking about is I know a lot of growers that will read a research paper and then make decisions based off of that paper. Whereas if you talk to the actual researcher, they'll say, I don't know if you can draw this as a conclusion based off my research. And then they go into depth as to why, whether it was the methodology or the parameters they established, or maybe the results weren't as statistically significant, or, for whatever reason. But having those conversations with the researcher and allowing them to explain their research and what sorts of direction that may point us as an industry based on this topic that they are just hyper knowledgeable about. And that's the great thing, like you mentioned, is we get to learn. We're having people on that, well, in my case, I would say are much smarter than me. And I hold you in that in that bucket as well. But getting to interview people that are just so intelligent and experienced, because some are growers too, just very experienced in either growing a crop or researching a topic, really allows you to get a better understanding of it in a way that I don't think you can get from reading a research paper or from, all the other ways that we can take in information these days. So
Yeah, I mean, there's nuances to every data point, right? And to every piece of information. And even if I think about lighting research across lettuce species, right? Like, I mean, some researchers try to study like 20 different species, all under the same, ratios of different wavelengths of light. And it's amazing how every single species responds differently to these wavelengths of light. And so what are you supposed to take away from that if you grow kale, right? Like is my kale going to respond the same way to those wavelengths of light as those 20 other species of lettuce, which kale is not lettuce, right? And so it's like, well, how do you connect the dots? Are there dots to even be connected? And which is why also I think I love Bruce's response, like just give him a quantity, because when it comes to a leafy green, like if you're at 800 micromoles, um, pretty much all the lettuce is happy, and anything above that is less useful, and anything below that, right, is you're not going to maximize your yield. So it's like, okay, we haven't quite figured out the spectrum for every species of lettuce, but at least we know 800 micromoles is good for every head of lettuce. So at least you can start there. And with cannabis, I mean, the number of cultivars and strains and morphologies, right? Like, wow. I wonder if anyone, have you heard anyone, Tad, like try to estimate the number of cultivars or strains that we have out in the market or that growers are growing? It's got to be thousands, right?
Oh, I think it has to be even greater than that. I mean, the genetic diversity as a crop, if you consider cannabis a crop, it really doesn't exist in any other commercial crop. Um, we figured out that we love Honeycrisp apples and, Hass avocados. And so we've narrowed down to two or three species that are varieties that offer us very specific benefit, whether that's fruit size or disease resistance or pathogen resistance, for example. We just don't have that in cannabis. We're still discovering a variety of different cannabinoids, this entourage effect of how they all interact together. And it's much more driven, interesting, by consumer and marketing than any other crop that I'm aware of. It's more like the ornamental horticulture side of things almost in terms of that diversity and chasing the next greatest, flower or plant or something. It's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and so when I think about, and we have barely done any research on the cannabis plant other than, right, like THC. I mean, and when I'm saying research, like, yes, there's a lot of growers that have maybe an in-house R&D room, right? Or they're playing with different strains and getting different genetics, and we have breeders who are breeding different cultivars. But at the end of the day, I mean, growers are growing, right, 6 to 8 different strains in the same space, whether it's a greenhouse or it's an indoor room. And you just don't see that kind of variety usually in vegetable production, right? Like you're growing
Yeah.
butterhead lettuce, you're growing kale, you're growing, TOV, tomato on the vine, plants that all have basically, the same morphology, or you're training them all the same way and have the same water requirements. And we don't do that with cannabis, right? I mean, we create like such a variety, um, or such a variable environment just by having all those different strains. And which is why I think it's so important to have in-house crop registration and plant steering program. But what you learn in one facility, how do you apply that to another facility that has 8 completely different strains, right? And or from a greenhouse to an indoor, or from a facility in Humboldt versus a facility in Oklahoma. Like those are so different, those environments, and just ways of growing, different strains. So uh, we definitely need more research in I guess, just the agronomic side of cannabis production. And it would be nice to find a standard. I don't know if when we will, if it'll be in our lifetime. But like you said, I mean, a lot of it is marketing, and I just really challenge cannabis growers to maybe rally around a few strains that everybody agrees, works in the most number of facilities and climates and, variables that we could all rally behind. But then maybe everybody has, a unique set of strains, which kind of gets to that craft grower mentality. But I don't know. For me, I travel so much, and when I go to dispensaries in other states, a lot of times I want to try my client's product, right? And to support them, and to maybe because there was something that had a great nose in the facility, and I want to see if it translated to the nose and taste outside of the facility. But even beyond that, it's like, okay, I'm very familiar with GG number 4 or Dream. And, if I'm somewhere that unfamiliar, I might actually try something that is familiar. And so I would almost love the cannabis industry to rally around a few familiar strains, even for the consumer who is not so distinguishing. They just want a cup of coffee, you know?
Well, I think so. Two thoughts here. The first is that for a medical consumer who is dealing with a particular issue, let's just throw out epilepsy, for example, um, and they get a very specific result from a cultivar that is grown in a very specific way, it's very hard to get consistency because of the fact
Yeah.
that people are changing genetics or changing cultivation practices or nutrient levels. And so, from a medical perspective, I think, or pharmaceutical perspective, you could say, I think that definitely holds some merit. Um, but I don't know. I think one of the things that, because a lot of people I know that listen to your podcast are not necessarily growing cannabis. You cover all crops. One of the things about the industry, I will say, is that it um, is one of the more innovative areas that we have left in terms of crop production and research. And cannabis growers as a whole are growing this crop with a lot of very different methods and very innovative methods, some of which are frankly terrible, I'll be honest, and some are quite ingenious. And I think that's where we can really learn is through going out and exploring, because we have cannabis also is a higher value crop than most commercial crops. And so they can put more money into research. They can put more money into innovation. And I think we're seeing that in some ways. And I'm hoping that the way I look at it is cannabis can push forward CEA in a way that will allow us to, as we move towards more issues with our climate and variability with our climate and climate change, towards ways to sustainably and efficiently grow other food crops as we have less control over our environment.
That's a really good point. And that is something that I love about cannabis growers is their love for the plant. There's been a lot of discussion lately in vertical farming, and I'll just say vegetable production in CEA, about how we kind of lost our way because there's so much investment money into CEA as a tech play, right? Into automation and AI, and I don't know, just like, you know, disrupting agriculture with CEA as a technology, and losing sight of the fact that we're farmers, right? Ultimately, at the end of the day,
Yeah.
we're farming and we're growing a plant and we're selling a product, for people to consume. And I have not seen that same, you know, dead end path necessarily with cannabis. Cannabis has always been centered around the plant. Yes, there's been a lot of investment money, maybe in places where it shouldn't have been, or like we're oversaturating markets, and there's a race to the bottom, and there are other challenges with cannabis, but it has not necessarily been the same challenges as vegetable CEA. With cannabis, it's really about like figuring out how to grow this plant, and these, various cultivars and strains, and really bring out the best in them, right? In terms of quality and color and taste and terpenes and et cetera, et cetera. And putting in the technology, or trying to put in the technology, that elicits those responses that we want from the plant. And so, yeah, I've always appreciated the cannabis industry for that love and focus on the plant. And that's actually something that I'm glad you brought up, because our listeners might notice that the majority of the growers that I interview are cannabis growers, which I think might surprise a lot of people. And quite honestly, the reason is that collaborative spirit, and that love for the plant, as opposed to a reach for IP and patents and trade secrets, which has plagued vegetable producers. And so I don't have a lot of lettuce growers or tomato growers, or pepper growers or strawberry growers on the podcast, because it's not that the growers don't necessarily want to talk about what they're doing. It's that management, the executives, the marketing team, they are afraid that growers are going to give away some secret sauce to how they grew this romaine lettuce, and that someone else is going to, compete with them to grow romaine lettuce. You guys, like, there is so much market potential to sell romaine lettuce in this entire country. Like, what are we really competing for? But when we're focused on IP and technology, then that's where you go, is protecting that, right? And so cannabis growers don't have that same hang up. They're really thinking about the plant, and they want to share their experience with other growers, and have, the permission to do so, or they are the permitters of that, and they're just like, the executive team, they trust me, or they know that, I'm talking to people anyway, and so I might as well do it here. I really respect cannabis growers for their openness, and their willingness to share their experience and knowledge with other growers. And I think that there's lettuce growers and tomato growers and, vegetable growers that have also learned from the cannabis growers, because that's where they can hear from others, at least openly and in public, right? I mean, you do talk to lettuce growers, and they're, yeah, yeah, we're talking to each other, but not openly and out loud, so to speak.
Yeah, I want to push back a little bit on that because we have had corporate cannabis as a major
For sure.
issue in in our industry, though I will say that what has happened sort of supports what you said initially about it all coming back to the farmer, because on scale, you have some of these brilliant scientists with all this money and all these people trying to grow on scale, in a variety of states, in these multi-state operations, and a lot of them are failing now. And some of that is just because, and I've seen the plants in some of these facilities, and they don't look as good. I just think a lot of it comes down to that grower, whoever's running the show, and a really good grower makes all the difference in the world. Like, we're just not there with technology. You can't completely modernize, at least at this point in time, and hopefully not ever, with AI and computers and robots, what a grower can see and what a grower can do and bring to the table with experience. But th- this
I
leads me to my
100%
next
agree.
question.
And just, on that, on the MSOs and, the large cannabis or corporate cannabis producers, who have expanded, and many of them have expanded very quickly, right? Is that they become stretched too thin, for one, which is kind of what happened in, the vertical farming industry too, is that they scaled too quickly, and didn't know, really how scaling was going to impact their operations, and their grow team. But also, I feel like a lot of those mergers and acquisitions, that it was like it was almost more like a real estate play, right? Where it was like, we want to outcompete everybody else, so we're just gonna like pluck these the competition up, right? Which I think is probably typical for an M&A kind of play. But what has happened is that, you know, uh, they don't necessarily they haven't fully vetted the facility that they are acquiring, right? And so they know that this facility, it operated, it has lights, it has HVAC, it has an irrigation room, like it has like all the basics, but they don't know how it should all work together. And when you have a grower who's been very successful at growing in this particular way, let's say in living soil, and now you have a new facility and you're asking that grower to replicate what they do in Rockwool, holy shit, like that is completely different, right? And
Mhm.
so now that grower is going to be like, well, let's switch it to living soil. And so maybe the executive team is like, yeah, you're right, that's what you do. And the other facility, we're going to switch it to living soil. But then they forget about how that impacts, the HVAC system or the
All the infrastructure.
workflow, or they put in different lights and maybe they should have used different, a different set of lights or whatever. That all of a sudden it becomes this mire, right? And like this slippery slope to more and more, I don't know, failed attempts at growing, when you made this one change because you thought that was the thing that made that other facility successful, when it was all the things, right? So um, we really are trying to get ahead of that with investors and buyers, to say like, look, let's take a step back and look at what you really have. And if you're going to grow in this way, then at least on the HVAC side, this is what you're going to be able to produce, and this is what you might want to think about upgrading or replacing in the future. So yeah, I totally agree with you. And unfortunately, like I say, we have 200 projects, but if you go to our website, you'll be like, I thought she said they have 200 projects, but there's only like a handful that are listed on the website. And it's because like these executive teams or these operators don't want us to say that we worked with them. I
Mhm.
mean, it's really disappointing and frustrating, honestly. It's like, can I get a testimonial on that? Well, no. Can I share that we increased production by 20%, or we reduced powdery mildew and you don't have it anymore? Well, no. And it's like, well, why? Is it because they don't want to admit that they had a problem and had to hire us? Is it because they uh don't want to give away that we were their secret sauce, right? And helped them. Or is it that they just don't understand what we did, and so they're afraid, because they don't understand that they are giving away some trade secret or IP by saying that we helped them, I don't know, change their HVAC system or save them $1 million by giving them the right HVAC system. I have no idea, but it's really frustrating, and that happens both from cannabis and everything else, for sure.
I mean, I can relate to everything you said. I have some NDAs that definitely look very similar to what you're describing. Unfortunately, as things become more corporate, they do become, it seems like, less collaborative. So,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. Well, we're running out of time. So I wanted to ask you a final question, in that, for people who enjoy this podcast and appreciate what you're doing here, how can they support you in your mission and support the podcast itself?
Thank you for asking that, Tad. Well, first off, if you listen to this podcast, if you enjoy this podcast, we would love to hear from you. We'd love you to, give us 5 stars, give us a thumbs up on, wherever you listen to the podcast. and to add some comments so that we can have more of that engagement between the community. We see a lot of comments on YouTube, which is great, but not so much on Apple and Spotify. So if you want to engage more, if you have questions for that guest or a question for me and some of my, specific lessons, of course, you can reach out via email or go to our contact page on the website and ask your question. But we'd love to see that engagement also on the various podcast platforms. Also, if you're an expert in your field or you're a grower and you have a unique way of doing something, or you just want to share some of your lessons learned and your successes with other growers, also contact us. And we'd love to talk to you and see if there's an opportunity to have you as a guest on the podcast. And if there's someone that you want to hear from, right? If there's an expert that we haven't interviewed that you think we should, we definitely want to hear from you on that. That was how we got Bruce Bugbee on, is that a lot of you said, why haven't you interviewed Bruce yet? Why haven't you interviewed Dr. Bugbee yet? And so I saw him at a conference. I was like, can I interview you? And he's like, yeah, let's do it next month. And so, done. That's one of the things that I'm most proud of, is the network and the relationships that I have, across growers and vendors and researchers and regulators and standard developers, is that, I know a lot of people, and if there's someone you want me to interview, I probably know them. If I don't know them, I want to get to know them because clearly they're making an impact in your life. And so, we want to share that knowledge with everybody else.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on your own podcast today and sharing a little bit of your story. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for hosting for me. I really appreciate it.
Well, I hope that went well, and thanks again. It's great to see you. I'm looking forward to the conference. I'll send you more information as we get it. We're still nailing down the schedule.
Okay.